The morning sun cast long shadows across the rugged Arizona territory as Hugh Glass adjusted his weathered hat and squinted at the canyon ahead. Most folks called him crazy, and perhaps they weren't entirely wrong. At 53 years old, when other men were settling into comfortable chairs by warm fires, Hugh was out here in Apache country, setting traps where angels feared to tread. Hugh had earned his reputation the hard way. Born in Pennsylvania to a family of farmers, he'd always been different. While his brothers were content tending crops and raising livestock, Hugh felt the call of the untamed wilderness. He'd spent decades as a mountain man, trapping beaver in the Rocky Mountains, surviving bear attacks that would have killed lesser men, and walking hundreds of miles through hostile territory with nothing but his wits and an iron will. The year was 1876, and the Apache Wars were raging across the Southwest. Geronimo's warriors controlled vast stretches of Arizona and New Mexico, making travel deadly for any white man foolish enough to venture into their domain. The U.S. Army had established a string of forts, but between these isolated outposts lay thousands of square miles of Apache-controlled wilderness. Hugh Glass wasn't interested in gold or glory like so many others who came west. He was a trapper, pure and simple, and he'd heard tales of pristine streams in Apache territory where beaver were so plentiful they'd practically jump into your traps. The problem was getting there alive and getting back out with your scalp still attached. Most people thought Hugh had finally lost his mind when he announced his intention to trap in the heart of Apache country. The saloon in the small trading post of Cedar Springs erupted in laughter when he laid out his plans. Old-timers shook their heads and muttered about fools and their money being soon parted. Even the local Apache scouts working for the army tried to dissuade him, warning of war parties that moved like ghosts through the canyons. But Hugh had something most men lacked. He understood the Apache mind. He'd spent years studying their tactics, learning their language from captured warriors and observing their movements from a distance. He knew they were brilliant fighters, masters of guerrilla warfare who could appear and disappear like smoke. What most white men saw as unpredictable savagery, Hugh recognized as sophisticated military strategy. The Apache controlled their territory through a network of lookouts, signals, and rapid communication. They knew every rock, every water source, every game trail. They could move large war parties across the landscape without leaving a trace that cavalry scouts could follow. But Hugh had noticed something that others missed. They had patterns, preferences, and most importantly, they had blind spots. As Hugh rode deeper into the wilderness, leading a pack mule loaded with traps and supplies, he felt the familiar thrill of entering truly dangerous territory. This wasn't the kind of danger that came from wild animals or harsh weather. This was the electric tension of knowing that at any moment, Apache warriors might materialize from behind rocks or from the canyon walls above. He'd chosen his route carefully, following game trails that Apache war parties typically avoided because they were too exposed to army patrols. It was a calculated risk. The trails offered less cover but also less chance of running into hostile warriors. Hugh was betting that his knowledge of Apache movement patterns would keep him alive long enough to reach the remote canyon system he'd scouted months earlier. The canyon he was heading for was perfect for his purposes. It had everything a trapper needed: multiple streams flowing with clear mountain water, signs of abundant beaver activity, and most importantly, it was in a location that Apache war parties typically bypassed. The canyon was too far from major army routes to be strategically important, but it was also too isolated for most Apache bands to use as a regular camping spot. Hugh had spent weeks planning this expedition, studying maps, talking to anyone who'd traveled through Apache country and lived to tell about it. He'd learned that the Apache preferred certain types of terrain for their camps and avoided others. They liked elevated positions with multiple escape routes, access to water, and clear views of approaching threats. The canyon Hugh had chosen violated most of these preferences, making it an unlikely place for Apache activity. As the sun began to set on his third day of travel, Hugh finally caught sight of his destination. The canyon mouth opened before him like a gateway to another world. Steep walls rose on either side and he could hear the sound of running water echoing from within. More importantly, he could see the distinctive V-shaped wakes of beaver swimming in the stream that flowed out of the canyon. Hugh made camp that night just outside the canyon entrance, following all the precautions that had kept him alive through decades of wilderness living. He built no fire, ate cold rations, and slept with his rifle within arm's reach. Tomorrow he would enter the canyon and begin setting his trap line, but tonight he would rest and prepare for what he knew would be the most dangerous trapping expedition of his life. In the distance, a coyote howled, and Hugh smiled grimly. If coyotes were calling, it meant no Apache war parties were moving through the area tonight. The Apache knew that their presence silenced the natural sounds of the wilderness, and they often used this knowledge to detect each other's movements. Hugh had learned to read these same signs, turning Apache tactics against them. As stars appeared in the clear desert sky, Hugh Glass settled in for what might be his last peaceful night's sleep for weeks to come. Tomorrow the real work would begin, and with it the deadly game of cat and mouse that would ultimately pit his cunning against 300 Apache warriors. Dawn broke clear and cold as Hugh Glass led his pack mule into the narrow canyon. The walls rose hundreds of feet on either side, creating a natural corridor that seemed to stretch endlessly into the heart of the mountains. The sound of his mule's hooves echoed off the stone walls, and Hugh winced at each noise, knowing that sound traveled far in this confined space. The stream that ran through the canyon bottom was everything Hugh had hoped for and more. Crystal clear water tumbled over smooth rocks, creating dozens of perfect spots for beaver dams. Fresh chew marks on aspen trees told him the beaver population was thriving, untouched by other trappers who lacked the courage or foolishness to venture this deep into Apache territory. Hugh worked methodically, choosing his trap locations with the skill of a master craftsman. Each trap had to be placed perfectly to catch beaver without alerting them to human presence. More importantly, each trap had to be positioned so Hugh could check it quickly and quietly. In Apache country, spending too much time in one spot could mean death. By midday, Hugh had set 20 traps along a 2-mile stretch of the stream. It was backbreaking work, wading through ice-cold water, carrying heavy steel traps and carefully concealing each one. But as he worked, Hugh felt the satisfaction that came from practicing a skill he'd perfected over decades. Every trap was a small masterpiece of engineering and woodcraft. What Hugh didn't know was that his entry into the canyon had not gone unnoticed. High above on the canyon rim, an Apache scout named Running Wolf had spotted the dust cloud from Hugh's mule hours earlier. The young warrior had immediately sent smoke signals to alert other Apache bands in the area, but he'd been ordered to observe rather than attack. The Apache were facing their own strategic challenges. Army patrols had been pressing them hard for months, forcing them to constantly move their camps and avoid large gatherings. A white trapper operating alone in their territory was unusual enough to warrant careful study. Perhaps this lone man could lead them to larger groups of soldiers or settlers. Running Wolf watched with growing respect as the white man worked below. This was no ordinary tenderfoot blundering through Apache land. The trapper moved with purpose and skill, and his choice of camping spots showed he understood basic wilderness survival. More intriguingly, the man seemed to know he was in hostile territory but showed no signs of panic or haste. As the afternoon wore on, Hugh began to feel eyes upon him. It was an instinct developed through years of living on the edge of danger, a sixth sense that had saved his life more times than he could count. He continued working, but his awareness sharpened. Every shadow, every bird call, every whisper of wind through the canyon became significant. Hugh had experienced this feeling before during his legendary encounter with a grizzly bear in the Dakotas. On that occasion, his failure to trust his instincts had nearly cost him his life. The bear had mauled him so severely that his companions had given him up for dead, taking his weapons and equipment before abandoning him in the wilderness. Hugh had crawled and walked over 200 miles to reach safety, an ordeal that had become legend among mountain men. This time, Hugh was determined to listen to his instincts. Without appearing to do so, he began scanning the canyon walls above. Apache warriors were masters of concealment, but Hugh had learned to look for things that seemed slightly out of place. A shadow that was too regular, vegetation that had been disturbed, or the glint of metal in sunlight. It took him nearly an hour of careful observation, but finally Hugh spotted what he was looking for. On the north rim of the canyon, approximately 800 yards upstream from his position, a small section of brush moved against the wind. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but Hugh's experienced eye caught the anomaly immediately. One Apache scout meant there were others nearby. Hugh knew that Apache warriors rarely worked alone, especially when observing potential threats. Running Wolf was probably part of a larger group, and that group was likely already moving to surround the canyon. Hugh found himself in the exact situation every trapper feared most. Trapped in a confined space with Apache warriors controlling the high ground, most men would have panicked, abandoned their traps, and tried to flee immediately. But Hugh Glass was not most men. Instead of running, he continued setting traps, but now he was setting a different kind of trap entirely. Every movement he made was calculated to convince the watching Apache that he was unaware of their presence. Hugh had noticed something during his reconnaissance of the canyon that might prove crucial. About 3 miles upstream, the canyon split into 3 separate branches. 2 of the branches were narrow dead ends that would trap anyone who entered them. The third branch led to a series of high meadows and eventually connected to a network of game trails that could provide escape routes. More importantly, Hugh had discovered that the middle branch contained a natural choke point where the canyon walls narrowed to less than 30 feet apart. Ancient rock slides had created a jumbled maze of boulders that formed the perfect location for an ambush. If Hugh could lure pursuing Apache warriors into that bottleneck, he might be able to turn the tables on them. As evening approached, Hugh made camp in full view of the watching scout. He built a small fire, cooked a meal, and settled in as if planning to spend a peaceful night in the canyon. But as soon as darkness fell, Hugh put his plan into motion. Working by feel alone, Hugh began dismantling his traps and moving them upstream toward the canyon's 3-way split. It was dangerous work in the darkness, but Hugh had developed an almost supernatural ability to move silently through rough terrain. Years of avoiding detection by hostile Indians had taught him to place each foot carefully, to avoid loose rocks, and to move his body in ways that created no sound. One by one, Hugh relocated his traps to new positions in and around the narrow bottleneck. But these weren't beaver traps anymore. Hugh was adapting his steel traps for a far more dangerous prey. By dawn, he would have created a gauntlet that would challenge even the most skilled Apache warriors. As Hugh worked through the night, he couldn't help but smile grimly at the irony of his situation. The man they called crazy was about to attempt something that truly was insane, using trapping techniques against Apache warriors in their own territory. If his plan worked, it would be the most audacious feat in the history of the American frontier. If it failed, Hugh Glass would become just another skeleton bleaching in the desert sun. As the first pale light of dawn crept into the canyon, Hugh Glass put the finishing touches on his deadly masterpiece. Working through the night with nothing but starlight and his intimate knowledge of steel traps, he had transformed the narrow bottleneck into something no Apache warrior had ever encountered before. Hugh's plan was built on his deep understanding of both Apache psychology and the mechanical principles of trapping. Apache warriors were among the finest light infantry fighters in the world, capable of moving across rough terrain with incredible speed and stealth. But their very excellence created a weakness that Hugh intended to exploit. Apache warriors were accustomed to fighting enemies who used conventional military tactics. Soldiers formed ranks, cavalry charged in straight lines, and battles followed predictable patterns. What they had never faced was an enemy who thought like a trapper, who understood that the key to catching any prey was to think several moves ahead and use the quarry's own instincts against them. The bottleneck where Hugh had positioned his modified traps was a natural funnel in the canyon. Ancient floods had carved the passage through solid rock, creating walls that rose straight up for over 200 feet. The floor of the passage was littered with boulders that had fallen from above over countless centuries, creating a maze of hiding spots and obstacles. Hugh had studied this terrain carefully during his initial scouting expedition. He knew that any Apache war party pursuing him up the canyon would be forced to pass through this bottleneck. There was simply no other route that would allow them to follow his trail while maintaining the speed necessary for an effective pursuit. The brilliance of Hugh's trap lay not in its complexity but in its simplicity. He had positioned his steel traps at precisely the spots where Apache warriors would naturally place their feet while moving through the boulder field. These weren't random placements but careful calculations based on Hugh's understanding of how skilled fighters moved through difficult terrain. Apache warriors were trained from childhood to move silently and efficiently across any landscape. They instinctively chose the most stable footing, the clearest sight lines, and the positions that offered the best tactical advantages. Hugh had anticipated these choices and prepared accordingly, but Hugh's trap was more sophisticated than simply placing steel jaws in a path. He had created what trappers called a funnel system that would force the Apache warriors to move in predictable patterns. By blocking certain routes with carefully arranged rocks and debris, Hugh had left only a few viable paths through the bottleneck. Each of these paths led directly to one of his modified traps. The steel traps themselves had been ingeniously adapted for their new purpose. Hugh had removed the chains that normally anchored beaver traps to prevent the animals from escaping. Instead, he had rigged each trap with a system of ropes and pulleys that would create noise and confusion when triggered. The goal wasn't to injure the Apache warriors, but to disrupt their coordinated movement and create chaos in their ranks. Hugh understood that Apache war parties relied on precise timing and communication to execute their lightning-fast attacks. If he could break up their formation and force them to scatter, he might be able to escape while they regrouped. It was a desperate gamble, but Hugh had survived impossible situations before by thinking unconventionally. As morning light revealed his handiwork, Hugh felt a mixture of pride and apprehension. The trap system was virtually invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. Casual observers would see nothing more than a typical boulder-strewn canyon passage. But Hugh knew that once triggered, his creation would transform the peaceful bottleneck into a scene of confusion and shouting. From his concealed position overlooking the trap zone, Hugh could see back down the canyon toward his original campsite. Smoke was rising from multiple locations along the canyon floor, telling him that Apache warriors were indeed following his trail. The smoke signals were a form of communication that allowed the pursuing war party to coordinate their movements without losing the element of surprise. Hugh counted at least 8 separate smoke columns, each representing a small group of warriors. Based on his knowledge of Apache tactics, each group probably consisted of 15 to 20 fighters. That meant he was facing between 160 to 200 warriors, far more than he had initially estimated. The numbers were daunting, but Hugh drew comfort from the fact that his trap system was designed to work best against large groups. The more warriors who entered the bottleneck simultaneously, the greater the chaos when the traps were triggered. A smaller group might be able to adapt quickly to the unexpected obstacles, but a large war party would take precious minutes to reorganize. Hugh had positioned himself in a carefully chosen observation post about 300 yards upstream from the trap zone. The location gave him a clear view of the entire bottleneck, while remaining concealed behind a jumble of fallen rocks. More importantly, his position was within easy reach of the escape route he had planned through the canyon's upper branches. As the morning progressed, Hugh watched the systematic advance of the Apache war party up the canyon. They moved with the fluid precision of a military unit that had fought together for years. Scouts ranged ahead of the main group, checking for ambushes and confirming the trail. The main body followed in small groups, each positioned to provide covering fire for the others. It was a textbook example of Apache's small unit tactics, and Hugh couldn't help but admire their skill even as he prepared to frustrate their advance. These weren't savage raiders, but highly trained soldiers executing a complex military operation. The fact that they were pursuing a single trapper with such overwhelming force spoke to their respect for his reputation as a dangerous opponent. Hugh noticed that the war party was being led by an older warrior whose elaborate war paint and distinctive weapons marked him as a chief or senior war leader. This was no routine patrol, but a deliberate expedition commanded by someone with significant authority. Hugh realized that his presence in Apache territory had been interpreted as something more threatening than simple trapping. The Apache had probably concluded that Hugh was either a spy gathering intelligence for the army or the advance scout for a larger group of settlers or soldiers. His ability to penetrate so deeply into their territory without detection had marked him as a serious threat that required immediate elimination. As the first Apache scouts approached the bottleneck, Hugh felt his heart rate increase despite his years of experience in dangerous situations. Everything now depended on whether his understanding of Apache movement patterns was accurate and whether his trap system would function as designed. In a few minutes, he would discover whether the man they called crazy was crazy enough to outwit 300 Apache warriors. The first Apache scout entered the bottleneck with the fluid grace of a mountain cat. Running Wolf moved from boulder to boulder, his eyes scanning for any sign of ambush while his feet found purchase on rocks, still wet with morning dew. Behind him, the main war party waited in tactical formation, ready to surge forward once he gave the all-clear signal. Hugh watched through a gap in the rocks, barely breathing as the young warrior approached the first of his concealed traps. Running Wolf paused for a moment, studying the terrain ahead with the careful attention that had kept him alive through dozens of raids and battles. Something about the boulder arrangement seemed slightly off to his trained eye, but he couldn't identify the specific threat. The trap was positioned exactly where Hugh had predicted it would be. Running Wolf chose a flat-topped boulder that offered stable footing and a clear view of the path ahead. As his moccasined foot came down on what appeared to be solid rock, the carefully concealed steel jaws snapped shut with a metallic crash that echoed off the canyon walls like a gunshot. Running Wolf leaped backward with lightning reflexes, his war cry mixing surprise with alarm. The trap hadn't caught his foot, but the sudden noise and movement had triggered exactly the reaction Hugh had intended. The young warrior's shout immediately alerted the entire war party that something was wrong in the bottleneck. What happened next unfolded with the precision of a clockwork mechanism. Apache warriors trained from childhood to react instantly to danger began moving toward the bottleneck at full speed. They flowed around and over the boulders like water, each warrior choosing the most direct route to support their threatened scout. Hugh had counted on this response. Apache military doctrine emphasized rapid concentration of force when one of their warriors was in danger. The entire war party would converge on Running Wolf's position within seconds, and in their haste to reach him, they would trigger the remaining traps in rapid succession. The second trap activated when a warrior named Stone Bear vaulted over a low boulder and landed on what he thought was solid ground. The steel jaws clamped shut on empty air, but the rope and pulley system Hugh had rigged began working exactly as designed. A heavy rock balanced on a ledge 30 feet above came crashing down, sending smaller stones cascading into the bottleneck. The third and fourth traps triggered almost simultaneously as more warriors poured into the narrow passage. Each activation created noise, movement, and confusion, but more importantly, each trap forced the Apache warriors to alter their planned routes through the boulder field. Warriors who had been moving in coordinated groups suddenly found themselves scattered and separated. Within 30 seconds of Running Wolf's initial encounter with the first trap, the entire bottleneck had erupted into chaos. War cries echoed off the canyon walls as Apache warriors tried to identify the nature of the threat they were facing. Some took cover behind boulders, expecting rifle fire from hidden enemies. Others continued forward, determined to close with whatever force had dared to challenge them. Chief Iron Hawk, the war leader commanding the expedition, watched the confusion with growing frustration. His warriors were among the finest fighters in the Apache nation, but they were reacting to an enemy they couldn't see or understand. The strange mechanical devices triggering throughout the bottleneck were unlike anything in their experience of warfare. Hugh observed the chaos with professional satisfaction. His trap system was working exactly as intended, but he knew the confusion would only last for a few minutes. Apache warriors were too skilled and experienced to remain disorganized for long. Soon they would adapt to the unexpected obstacles and resume their pursuit with even greater determination. The time had come for the most dangerous part of Hugh's plan. While the Apache warriors were still trying to understand what they were facing, Hugh began moving toward his prepared escape route. He had to cross approximately 200 yards of open ground to reach the mouth of the canyon's upper branch, and he would be visible to Apache lookouts for most of that distance. Hugh burst from his hiding place and began running toward the canyon split with the desperate speed of a man whose life depended on reaching cover. Behind him, shouts erupted from the Apache warriors as they spotted his fleeing figure. Warriors began climbing out of the bottleneck to pursue him, their confusion replaced by grim determination to catch the man who had made fools of them. The chase that followed tested every skill Hugh had developed during his decades as a mountain man. Apache warriors were legendary for their ability to run down enemies across difficult terrain, and Hugh was no longer a young man, but he had advantages that his pursuers lacked: intimate knowledge of his intended route and a specific destination in mind. Hugh reached the canyon split, just as the first Apache warriors cleared the bottleneck behind him. Without hesitation, he plunged into the middle branch of the canyon, the one that led to the high meadows and his planned escape routes. But Hugh had one more surprise waiting for his pursuers. During his night of trap setting, Hugh had taken time to create false trails leading into the other two branches of the canyon. Using techniques learned from other mountain men, He had left boot prints, disturbed vegetation, and even a few pieces of equipment to suggest that he had fled in multiple directions. The pursuing Apache warriors reached the canyon split and immediately faced a tactical dilemma. Their quarry's trail seemed to lead into all three branches simultaneously. If they divided their forces to pursue each trail, they risked allowing Hugh to escape. If they chose the wrong trail to follow en masse, they would lose precious time while he increased his lead. Chief Ironhawk made the decision that Hugh had hoped he would make. Unwilling to risk letting such a dangerous enemy escape, the chief divided his war party into 3 groups of roughly 100 warriors each. Each group would pursue one of the apparent escape routes, ensuring that Hugh would be caught regardless of which direction he had actually taken. Hugh, watching from a concealed position in the middle branch, smiled grimly as he saw the Apache forces divide. His plan was working perfectly. By splitting their overwhelming numerical advantage into 3 smaller groups, the Apache had given him a fighting chance to outrun his immediate pursuers. But Hugh's satisfaction was tempered by the knowledge that his most dangerous test still lay ahead. The middle branch of the canyon led to a series of high meadows, but reaching those meadows required climbing a treacherous trail that would leave him exposed and vulnerable. If the Apache warriors following his true trail were skilled climbers, they might still catch him before he could reach the relative safety of the open country above. As Hugh began the brutal ascent that would either lead to his escape or his death, he could hear the war cries of Apache warriors echoing from all 3 canyon branches. The man they called Crazy had managed to confuse and scatter 300 of the finest warriors on the continent, but the final outcome of his audacious gamble remained very much in doubt. The trail leading out of the middle canyon branch was barely more than a deer path carved into the sheer rock face. Hugh Glass climbed with the desperate energy of a man who knew that capture meant certain death. Below him, he could hear the voices of Apache warriors growing closer as they followed his true trail through the canyon. Hugh's lungs burned as the thin mountain air made every breath a struggle. At 53, his body was no longer capable of the superhuman endurance that had carried him through previous adventures. But his mind remained sharp, and his will unbroken. He forced himself to maintain a steady pace, knowing that speed was less important than avoiding a fall that would end his escape permanently. The trail switchbacked up the canyon wall in a series of narrow ledges connected by steep scrambles over loose rock. Each turn offered Hugh a brief view of his pursuers, and what he saw both encouraged and worried him. The Apache warriors were indeed following his trail, but they were climbing more cautiously than he was, taking time to examine the route for potential ambushes. Leading the pursuit was a warrior Hugh recognized from his observations of the war party. This was Windrunner, a legendary tracker whose reputation for following trails was known throughout the Southwest. If anyone could stay on Hugh's trail regardless of the tricks and false leads he might create, it was Windrunner. Behind Windrunner came approximately 30 of the finest Apache warriors Chief Ironhawk could field. These weren't young fighters eager for glory, but seasoned veterans who had survived countless battles against Mexican soldiers, American cavalry, and rival tribes. They climbed with the methodical persistence of men who knew that patience and endurance usually defeated speed and panic. Hugh reached a narrow ledge about halfway up the canyon wall and paused to catch his breath while assessing his situation. The good news was that he had gained some distance on his pursuers while they searched for his trail at the canyon split. The bad news was that Windrunner had quickly identified the correct route and was now climbing with determined efficiency. From his elevated position, Hugh could see into the other 2 canyon branches where the remaining Apache warriors were following his false trails. In the left branch, about 60 warriors were pursuing boot prints and disturbances that Hugh had carefully created to lead them into a dead-end box canyon. They would realize their mistake eventually, but it would cost them at least an hour to backtrack and rejoin the main pursuit. The right branch contained an even larger group of warriors, perhaps as many as 80 men, following the most elaborate of Hugh's false trails. Hugh had spent considerable time creating this deception, even going so far as to leave behind a worn-out moccasin and some tobacco crumbs to suggest that he had rested there while changing footwear. But Hugh knew that these delays were temporary. Once the Apache warriors discovered they were following false trails, they would converge on the middle canyon with overwhelming force. His only hope was to reach the high meadows before Windrunner Runner's group could catch him, and before the other groups could return to join the pursuit. The next section of the trail was the most dangerous Hugh had faced so far. The path traversed a nearly vertical rock face for almost 200 yards, with drops of several hundred feet to the canyon floor below. There was no cover, no opportunity for deception, and no way to speed up the crossing without risking a fatal fall. Hugh began the traverse with careful deliberation, testing each handhold and foothold before committing his weight to it. The rock was solid limestone, carved by centuries of wind and water into a surface that offered just enough irregularities to allow climbing. But the handholds were small and the footholds narrow, requiring constant attention and perfect balance. Halfway across the traverse, Hugh heard a sound that chilled his blood, the distinctive war cry that Apache warriors used to signal a successful tracking. Windrunner had reached the base of the rock face and could see Hugh's exposed figure moving slowly across the vertical wall above. What followed was a test of nerve unlike anything Hugh had experienced. In his long career as a mountain man, Apache warriors were renowned for their climbing abilities, developed through generations of warfare in the rocky terrain of the Southwest. Windrunner and his men began ascending the rock face with a speed that seemed to defy gravity. Hugh fought the urge to panic and increase his pace. One careless move would send him plummeting to his death, ending his escape and giving the Apache the victory they sought. Instead, he forced himself to maintain steady progress while his pursuers gained ground with every passing minute. The psychological pressure was enormous. Hugh could hear the Apache warriors calling to each other as they climbed, coordinating their ascent and sharing information about the best routes up the rock face. They were treating the pursuit like a military operation, bringing the same tactical discipline to climbing that they applied to combat. Windrunner was closing the gap with frightening speed. The Apache tracker moved up the rock face like a spider, finding handholds that Hugh had missed and taking risks that would have been suicidal for a less experienced climber. Hugh estimated that the warrior was gaining approximately 1 yard for every 10 yards of horizontal progress across the traverse, with 50 yards still to go before reaching the relative safety of the upper canyon. Hugh realized that Windrunner would catch him while he was still exposed on the rock face. The Apache warrior was now close enough that Hugh could hear his breathing and see the determination in his dark eyes. Hugh made a desperate decision that went against every instinct developed through decades of careful wilderness survival. Instead of continuing his methodical traverse, he began moving as quickly as the precarious footing would allow. It was a calculated gamble that speed might compensate for the increased risk of falling. The gamble almost failed immediately. Hugh's boot slipped on a patch of loose gravel, and for a terrifying moment he hung by his fingertips over the canyon floor far below. But desperation gave him strength he didn't know he still possessed, and he managed to find a new foothold just as his grip began to fail. Windrunner saw Hugh's near fall and immediately increased his own pace, sensing that his quarry was beginning to make the mistakes that would lead to capture. The Apache warrior was now less than 20 yards behind and gaining ground with every move. Hugh reached the end of the traverse with Windrunner's hand literally reaching for his boot. In one fluid motion that drew upon every skill he had learned in a lifetime of dangerous situations, Hugh rolled over the lip of the upper canyon and immediately began running toward the high meadows that represented his only chance of escape. Behind him, Windrunner completed the traverse seconds later and took up the pursuit with renewed determination. The chase was now a simple race between two skilled wilderness fighters, with the high mountain meadows offering the winner either escape or the opportunity for a final confrontation. Hugh Glass burst into the high meadow with his lungs burning and his heart pounding like a war drum. The mountain grass was thick beneath his feet, and pine trees dotted the landscape, offering the first real cover he had seen since beginning his desperate climb out of the canyon. But Windrunner was less than 50 yards behind him, and the sounds of other Apache warriors echoing from the canyon below told Hugh that his false trails had been discovered. The meadow stretched for nearly a mile before reaching the tree line of the high peaks beyond. If Hugh could reach those trees, he might be able to lose himself in the dense forest and make his way to safety. But crossing open ground while being pursued by the finest light infantry fighters in the world was almost certainly suicide. Hugh made another of the split-second decisions that had kept him alive through decades of wilderness adventures. Instead of running for the distant trees, He turned to make his stand in a cluster of large boulders near the center of the meadow. If he was going to die today, he would die fighting, rather than being run down like a deer. Windrunner emerged from the canyon seconds later and immediately spotted Hugh's position among the rocks. The Apache warrior raised his rifle and fired, the shot echoing across the meadow like thunder. The bullet struck stone inches from Hugh's head, sending rock chips flying and confirming that Windrunner was as skilled with firearms as he was at tracking. Hugh returned fire with his own rifle, a weapon he had carried for over 20 years and knew as well as his own hand. The bullet took Windrunner in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to one knee. But the Apache warrior was far from finished. Even wounded, he began working his way toward Hugh's position, using the scattered rocks and small trees for cover. What happened next became the stuff of legend throughout the American West. Hugh Glass, the man they called crazy, began the most audacious bluff in frontier history. Using skills learned from decades of trapping and hunting, Hugh began creating sounds and movements that suggested he was not alone among the rocks. Hugh threw stones to create noise in different locations, mimicked the calls that soldiers used to communicate with each other, and even fired shots from different positions to create the illusion of multiple defenders. He had observed enough military operations to know how soldiers coordinated their movements, and he used this knowledge to create a convincing deception. Windrunner, despite his wound, was too experienced a warrior to be easily fooled. But as more Apache fighters began emerging from the canyon behind him, Hugh's deception took on new significance. The other warriors, hearing multiple rifle shots and apparent military signals coming from the rocks, began to suspect that they had walked into a carefully planned ambush. Chief Ironhawk was among the second wave of warriors to reach the meadow. The war chief had been following the trail in the middle canyon when his scouts reported the sound of gunfire from above. Now seeing Windrunner pinned down by what appeared to be a significant force of hidden enemies, Ironhawk faced a tactical nightmare. The Apache had learned through bitter experience that fighting entrenched soldiers in defensive positions was costly and dangerous. American troops might lack the mobility and fieldcraft of Apache warriors, but they were well armed and deadly when fighting from prepared positions. Ironhawk had lost too many good men in frontal assaults against dug-in soldiers to risk another such attack. Hugh continued his elaborate deception, using every trick he had learned about military tactics and Apache psychology. He fired from one position, then quickly moved to another rock formation and fired again, creating the impression of multiple riflemen supporting each other. He called out commands in English, knowing that some of the Apache warriors understood enough of the language to recognize military terminology. The bluff worked beyond Hugh's wildest hopes. As more Apache warriors reached the meadow and took cover around its perimeter, they reported seeing muzzle flashes from numerous positions among the rocks. The combination of Hugh's movements, his strategic use of sound, and the natural human tendency to see what they expected to see created the illusion of a well-defended position held by perhaps 20 or 30 soldiers. Ironhawk found himself in an impossible situation. If he ordered a direct assault on the rocks, he would likely succeed in overrunning the position, but the cost in casualties would be enormous. If this was indeed an army patrol, there might be additional troops nearby who would respond to the sound of battle. The smart tactical decision was to withdraw and return with a larger force, but retreating from a single trapper would be a humiliation that Ironhawk could not accept. The war chief was caught between his military judgment, which counseled caution, and his personal honor, which demanded that he destroy the man who had made fools of his warriors. The standoff continued for nearly an hour, with Apache warriors maintaining their positions around the meadow, while Hugh continued his one-man deception from among the rocks. Windrunner, despite his wound, had worked his way to within 30 yards of Hugh's position and was beginning to suspect the truth. The experienced tracker had seen no clear evidence of multiple defenders, and the pattern of gunfire was starting to seem suspicious. As the afternoon sun began to sink toward the western peaks, Ironhawk made his decision. He would send a small group of his most skilled warriors to probe the defensive position, while keeping the majority of his force in reserve. If the defenders were indeed numerous and well-positioned, the probe would reveal their strength without committing his entire force. If the defenders were fewer than they appeared, the probe would expose the deception. Hugh saw the Apache warriors beginning to move and knew that his bluff was about to be called. 8 of Ironhawk's finest fighters were working their way toward the rocks using a coordinated approach that would bring them into contact with his position from multiple directions simultaneously. Once they reached close range, his deception would be exposed and the entire war party would converge on his location. In that moment of desperate clarity, Hugh Glass made the decision that would cement his legend forever. Instead of waiting for the Apache probe to expose him, he stood up among the rocks and called out in the Apache language he had learned over the years. "I am Hugh Glass," he shouted, his voice carrying clearly across the meadow. "I am alone. I have led you on a chase through your own country and scattered 300 of your finest warriors with nothing but steel traps and cunning. If you want me, come and take me." The meadow fell silent as Hugh's words sank in. Ironhawk stared at the lone figure standing defiantly among the rocks, scarcely able to believe what he was hearing. One man had created all this chaos, confusion, and delay. One aging trapper had outfoxed an entire war party using nothing but his knowledge of their psychology and tactics. Windrunner, understanding the situation better than anyone else, began to laugh despite his wound. It was the laughter of a professional warrior, recognizing a masterful performance by a worthy opponent. Soon other Apache fighters joined in, their laughter echoing across the high meadow as they appreciated the audacity of what Hugh had accomplished. Chief Ironhawk faced a choice that would define his leadership and his honor. He could order his warriors to kill the defiant trapper, ending Hugh's life but gaining nothing more than revenge. Or he could acknowledge that Hugh Glass had earned something that few white men ever received from the Apache: genuine respect as a worthy adversary. Ironhawk made his decision. He called out across the meadow in clear English, "You may go, Hugh Glass. You have proven yourself cleverer than 300 Apache warriors. We will not forget this day and we will not pursue you further." Hugh Glass walked out of the high meadow that evening as the sun set behind the western peaks, leading his pack mule and carrying his traps as if he had simply completed a routine expedition. Behind him, 300 Apache warriors watched in respectful silence as the man they had called crazy disappeared. Into the gathering darkness, the story of Hugh Glass and his incredible trap spread throughout the Southwest. Told around campfires by Apache warriors, Army scouts, and mountain men alike. They called him crazy until his trap brought 300 Apache warriors to a halt. But after that day, they called him something else entirely. They called him legend.